Lars's heart pounded in his chest as he swam through the icy Pacific. His palms stretched into the seawater, propelling him forward, a sweet burn radiating through his thighs. The sting of rising swells wasn't enough to thwart the memory from playing through his mind. Nearly 2 months ago, he'd been surfing with his colleague, Seth Termaine. A hail of gunfire had erupted from a cliff precipice, spraying across the beach and into the ocean. While he and Seth had avoided the bullets, they'd caught sight of a terrified brunette taking a direct hit to her shoulder. Without hesitation, Lars had swum to shore. Running toward her, he'd fallen to his knees in the blood-stained sand. As another shot sounded, he'd scooped her up in his arms and sped toward an alcove in the cliff. Cradling her to his chest, he hid within the darkened cave. Laying her on the ground, he'd removed her jacket and located the puncture wound. Her fierce emerald eyes had blinked up at him. With his name on her trembling lips, she'd pleaded, "Lars, help me." Broken and beautiful, she'd succumbed to the impending loss of consciousness. As sirens blared in the breeze, he'd held on to her. Minutes stretched like hours. When the medics had finally arrived, Lars had insisted on going in the ambulance, remaining by her side until they'd whisked her into surgery. Lars had sat in the waiting room staring at his hands. The dried blood caked on his skin. He'd reluctantly accepted a warm washcloth from a nurse, who'd repeatedly encouraged him to get examined. Shaking her off, he'd stubbornly remained, steadfastly waiting on news of her condition. By the time the police had arrived, he'd composed himself, hiding his frustration that neither he nor Seth could provide a detailed description of the assailant. While she'd survived the procedure to repair the tear in her artery, she'd contracted a hospital-acquired sepsis infection, which had left her unresponsive for a few days. Never leaving her bedside, he'd willed the mysterious Jane Doe to heal. When she'd regained consciousness, a flicker of recognition registered in her eyes. The nurses immediately sprang into action, assessing her condition. Lars hadn't been able to speak to her, as the medical team hastily ushered him out of her room.